Well, we're talking about learning to read the Bible. And Jerry, I think when people start learning to read the Bible or trying to read the Bible maybe for the first time or really getting into it, one of the key things they need to do is find a Bible. So that's pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of us, we know there's Bible apps that we can get on our phone where you can get the Bible, but if you have a Bible at home and you're not an avid Bible reader, most likely you have a family Bible or a Bible that's been passed down and has words like thee and thou and might be difficult, and I think that throws people off. So what should people know about starting to read the Bible?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So I think one of the kind of foundational issues when it comes to choosing a Bible that you want to use for your everyday study of the Bible is to understand that there are different theories of translation. There's kind of a spectrum. And so there's a whole lot of English Bibles out there, and they sort of exist on this spectrum from, on one side, kind of very literal translations, and then on the other end, you have sort of, instead of a word-for-word translation, you have what's sometimes referred to as a thought-for-thought translation. So at this end, a very literal word-for-word, and at this end of the spectrum, you have translations that try to capture the essence or the meaning of the text in modern language and in modern idiom. So for example, Psalm 23:5 has the phrase, "He anointed my head with oil." The Good News translation, which is sort of at this end of the thought for thought, translate that as "He welcomed me as an honored guest." And so they're trying to take this idea of "He anointed my head with oil" and put that in language that people in the 21st century would understand.
Yeah, so if you were going to recommend some versions for someone who is newer at reading the Bible, what would you recommend to say, like, hey, start with this and this would probably be the best, or this will help you. You know? So what would you recommend to people?
Yeah, so for an absolute beginner, for somebody who's just starting to read the Bible, I would shoot for something that's somewhere in the middle of those two sort of end pieces, like the NIV. I think the NIV is a great translation, and the NIV Study Bible is one of the best study Bibles you can buy.
It really is. It really is. Like, that's what I use when I do my reading, and it's just really helpful.
Yeah, and so with the other translations, I mean, there's strengths and weaknesses with both. So with the word for word, one of the things that you sometimes lose is with the thought for thought, is that you sometimes lose the specific ideas being conveyed in the text. Whereas with the literal translations, what you sometimes lose is readability. They sometimes come across as very wooden.
Yeah, it's like, what is this saying again?
Yeah.
Because it's coming from a different language to our language, it doesn't exactly come out the same. And so I think NIV is great. I like the New Living Translation too. English Standard Version, but go more for the word for word. And so now, Jerry, now that we know how to read it and it's easy to read, what are some assumptions we should come to the Bible with, saying, like, when we read this, here's what we need to know before we really dive deep?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think the starting point is just simply the question of what is the Bible, and what should we be taking out of the Bible as we read it, and that's a bit of a big question.
It is.
And so I think the starting point is to understand that the Bible is the story of God's dealing with humanity and God's efforts to restore humanity back to a relationship with Himself. That's the story of the Bible in a nutshell. And if you understand that as sort of the overarching story of the Bible, then you can sort of begin to make sense of the component pieces of the Bible.
Yeah, I love in the Jesus Storybook Bible, which is what I read to my kids often. You know, I love the very first story in there is about the Bible, and one of my favorite things they say is, like, the Bible is not about you.
Yeah,
I love that.
Yeah,
like, we think,
right.
like, oh, we're reading it, it's not about you, it's primarily about God.
That's right. And so when you think about the Bible in those terms, that totally changes how you read the various stories. Like, for example, if you're reading the story of Samson, even that story is not ultimately about Samson, it's about God, and it's about the fact that, for example, God uses deeply flawed people for his purposes.
Yeah.
Which is really encouraging to me.
Is encouraging to me too. And you know what, when you look at the Bible, you'll see that there's barely any characters that are perfect.
That's
except
right.
Jesus.
That's right.
Like, I love that. Like, every person has these, they make a decision that's the wrong decision. Like, most of it's good. Sometimes all of it's bad, but most of it's good. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that was messed up, or that was messed up, and that was messed up. And I think God knew what he was doing when he wrote the Bible, because he wanted us to see that God doesn't use perfect people, because there aren't any.
Yeah, and I think part of the beauty of the Bible is its messiness, is the fact that it shows the good, the bad, and the ugly of how God's people have responded to God's grace, sometimes in good ways and sometimes in really horrible ways, like David and Bathsheba. The Bible doesn't shy away from telling the dark side of how God has interacted with his chosen people. And so I think the key question when you read the Bible is, of any passage, is what is this teaching me about God?
That's really good.
You know, and it's a simple question, and if you start there, it'll lead you to a good place. So.
It really will. All right, Jerry, so we know we should get a good translation. We have some ideas about the primary. We can talk about that for hours and hours. But when we come to the Bible, this is different because it's not a novel, right? It's not a history textbook. It's not an encyclopedia. It actually has lots of different genres. So what do we need to be aware of when we open up the Bible?
Yeah, so we sometimes do talk about the Bible as a grand narrative or as a meta-narrative, as this story that attempts to make sense of the whole world that we live in. And I think the Bible does that. But when you think about that, though, you also have to realize that a whole lot of the Bible is not story.
Yeah.
And so how does that fit into what we're calling the story of God's dealing with his people? So I think a good example is what we sometimes call the wisdom literature. So like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, songs. These are not necessarily stories, but they are, I think, examples of character formation that is central to the bigger story of what it means to be God's people.
Yeah.
And so I think when you understand that, and you understand that there are things like parables, things that are figurative forms of speech, or there are poetry, there are songs in the Bible. And so you have to read each of those according to what they are.
Yeah, and so I've found it helpful to think of not every story, not every part of the Bible is a story that teaches you something about God or a moral to be learned, but sometimes it's direct teaching, right? It's like, hey, this is what you should know. It's not a story. And then other ones are kind of like, here's some principles, just like you're saying. And it's important to know what you're reading at the right time. And I used to teach at a university at one point, and I talked about reading the Bible, and I said, hey, listen, the Bible, right, has different parts of literature, and reading a comic strip is not the same as reading a cookbook, right? So like a cookbook has very direct instructions, like follow this, but a comic strip is kind of there for your entertainment. And so knowing what you're reading is really important. And as you read more of the Bible, you'll get more into it. Well, thanks for joining us in this session of Reading the Bible.